Okay, so we have wrapped up the book of Jonah, but we still have at least one lingering question, and that is, does God change his mind? Now, if we look at the entire story of Jonah, we see that at the beginning, God is going to send Jonah to Nineveh to call for them to repent. Because in 40 days, God is going to destroy them, remove them from the face of the earth. And then at the beginning of chapter 4, Jonah is angry at God. And he says, "Isn't this what I said, Lord, when I was still at home? This is what I tried to forestall by fleeing to Tarshish. I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity." So did God change his mind? Did he rescue and save the people of Nineveh? Well, let's look at this. Let's look at this personality. Let's look at this observation that Jonah has here. He says, "I knew that you were a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, a God who relents from sending calamity." Now, before we get into the answer to the question about Nineveh, let's take a look at the history of the Old Testament, and we see several instances where God threatens or says, "Should I destroy?" This happens a lot actually with Moses. A couple of times with Moses, where Moses goes, "No, no, no, God, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it." But if you think that God changes his mind, then how do you get around the idea of sovereignty? And how do you get around the idea that God is omniscient and omnipotent and he knows everything? How do you get around these things if God changes his mind? Which would mean that God would be indecisive. So there's a hole in the question. Does God really change his mind? Well, if you look back and you look at what God was doing with Moses, God wasn't going to destroy the Israelites. He was using it as an opportunity to remind Moses of what it is that he was there to do. Remember, Moses was a man that had the greatest of highs and the lowest of lows. And when God went to him at the burning the bush, Moses had experienced the lowest of lows and was at the source of greatest humility, and also at the source of his greatest struggle to know whether or not he was actually even worthy to do these things. Well, God understood this, and so he used these as opportunities to remind Moses of his responsibilities in the situation. So at no point was God going to actually destroy the people that he very well promised. Now, God also, if you remember, gave several promises to the Israelites in the first 5 books of the Old Testament that reminded them of what was going to happen to them if they turned away from God. Now, this is important because this is where the gracious and compassionate part of Jonah's observation comes in, because God continued to be gracious and compassionate to the Israelites for hundreds and hundreds of years after they had turned away from God. And God gave them opportunity after opportunity to experience revival, to experience an opportunity to turn back to him, because God is slow to anger and abounding in love. Just like a parent to a child, we don't want to discipline our child. We want our children to learn, and we want our children to figure out what not to do in a way that doesn't have them be disciplined. Unfortunately, though, like us, our children oftentimes won't listen to those warnings and instead will continue down a path until there is a point of no return. That happened with the people of Israel, and it actually happens to the people of Nineveh. Because there is another book that falls a little further into the Old Testament, the Book of Nahum. And Nahum takes place around 100 years after the time of Jonah. Do you know what the Book of Nahum is about? The fall of Nineveh, the judgment of Nineveh. See where it says God relents from sending calamity. That means that God holds off from it. God acquiesces for a season. God's grace abounds until the point where it can no longer abound. God does not change his mind. God might hold off on things until there is no other option. But at that point, God then allows the things that he has promised to come to fruition. God didn't withhold the promise from the people of Israel. Eventually, Israel was scattered to the winds, just as God promised to Abraham. God promised in the Torah. He said, if you follow my commands, you will be flourished and blessed. But if you turn away, you will be scattered to the winds. Same thing with Nineveh. God relented with Nineveh this one time, but eventually the judgment did happen. Jonah forestalled the judgment, but God never changed his mind that judgment was going to come. Okay, see you next time.